All right, we are back. I believe, yes, we are back. So, um, yeah, this is going to be a great part two. I believe there's a lot of things that I want to cover today that kind of put more things on the shelf, and then we'll get into the breaking the crack of the shelf, and then the breaking of the shelf, and some of this stuff hits very close to home, so I'll probably get a little bit worked up. So bear with me. If you didn't watch part one, I would encourage you to, only because in part one it gives a lot of context of kind of my upbringing as far as when I was active in the church, when I wasn't, why I got reactivated, some experiences on my mission, a little bit about my marriage to Kimberly, and I guess just some of the things that went up on the shelf, some of the temple ceremony stuff. I kept it pretty high level because um, I don't want to offend my true believing friends and family. So if you saw that, my chair, the compressor or the like the shock in it is kind of going out. So every once in a while, it like drops like half inch or so. So I may be like sitting on the floor by the end of this thing. Uh, anyway, I think it's my chair saying, "Hey, dude, we gotta shed some weight here." So my mountain bike did the same thing to me last year. Anyway, I digress. Like I said before, I am a tangent guy. It's so easy for me to get off topic, and so hopefully that doesn't bother anybody here. Um, yeah, went into some of the church service that we've done, some of the areas that I've supported, not supported, like Scouts. I've never been a fan of Scouts, and we're going to get into a little bit more of that here. Depending on where we cut off, actually, this part, I might go through the end of what I've got here in my notes, but we also might just stop depending on time. So let's pick up where we left off here, and get right into my career, which kind of sets the stage. See, I just dropped it again. I swear I'm going to be sitting on the floor. Uh, so my career, I work as a fraud investigator, and there's different areas of fraud investigation that one might do. Mine in particular is on healthcare fraud. So I investigate doctors, durable medical equipment companies, pharmacies, insurance members that might be committing a fraud against an insurance plan. So that's my professional experience. I've been doing that for quite some time. I've been at my company for over 20 years now, and been doing the fraud work for most of that. So it's an area that hits really close to home. So when we start talking the F word, fraud, my ears perk, and I understand fraud quite well. Maybe not in all realms, but as a kind of high level, what is fraud? I obviously understand it very well. So a couple of things though with my work, it's been interesting because I've been through different experiences with the church that through time, there's been some things that have left me kind of questioning, uh, but I put those things up on my shelf and say, no, that's no way to build a testimony. We put that stuff away and we focus on the testimony building things. And I've been pretty good at doing that thus far, in up to this point in my life. But there's a couple things with work that are just kind of interesting, and I'm not going to share uh, hardly any level of detail because, well, kind of for obvious reasons. A lot of these things are older cases that have been already adjudicated through the court system, but I won't be sharing any details, just more concepts, if you will. So one of them it was one thing I want to start with actually is what fraud is. And so you can talk about insurance fraud, like in my realm, but you can talk about, we're going to talk about securities fraud. Anybody that's been following church news for the last year-ish, you'll know that there's quite a bit of that. And I'm gonna dive into super detail on that one. But there's all kinds of fraud, but the common denominator with fraud is that it requires an intent. So, we do sometimes throw that word out quite frequently, maybe a little bit too quickly, the word fraud. But fraud doesn't necessarily mean that you got something that you didn't deserve. Like if you were to fill out, or if you were to get a loan and be accused of obtaining that loan through fraudulent means, they would have to prove that you intentionally deceived in order to get that loan. So the basic definition of fraud can be looked at as the intentional deception to get something that you're not entitled to. And I'm sure a lot of people might want to tear that definition apart, and I'm just trying to come up with a definition that works in a lot of areas. And so we're gonna just leave it there with the intentional deception to get something you're not entitled to. And then I'm going to apply that. And this isn't a self-serving definition either. Like, this is almost anywhere you go and look up a fraud statute, it requires you to prove that somebody intended to do that thing, and that through that deception, they got something they wouldn't have otherwise gotten. So it's not a self-serving definition at all. But we're going to apply that in several occasions here going forward. One of the things that was really interesting, though, in my line of work is we receive restitution checks. So if somebody defrauds the company in some way and it goes through the court system, then that individual would then pay back a restitution to the state, to all the victims, basically. And in this case, in the cases that I work with, my company is then considered the victim. And so this one individual is really interesting. They were convicted of fraud and ordered to pay restitution. And I shouldn't say most of their restitution, but a fair amount of their restitution was actually paid by their bishop, which was interesting because at that time, even now, I'm going, okay, so we pay tithing to the church, which is 10% of your income. And the belief is that that 10% of income is going to help build the kingdom. So it's hard for me to accept, and I'm probably being overly critical here, but it's hard for me to accept that somebody paying back something that they did wrong, that the bishop is actually paying that. And how does the bishop pay that? It's with the tithing, the dollars that the membership of the church give as a charitable donation. And so I've always been frustrated with that. There's another case that we had where an individual was working to sign up like a fraudulent application with my company, and in order to get the premiums to get paid, he asked, "Hey, can my bishop pay these premiums?" And so, just another example of what I would consider to be misuse of charitable funds. And again, I'm probably being overly critical. I always imagined my money that I donated going to, I just think of what I learned in the New Testament, what Christ would expect: to clothe the naked, feed the hungry, shelter, the homeless. Like, I'm thinking all these wonderful Christ-like things that this money can be used for. And and yet I've got bishops either paying or offering to pay for fraudulent activity. And that's always kind of rubbed me wrong. But at the same time, I want to give some grace here to these bishops. They're just trying to do the best they can. I know there's some bad eggs out there, and those ones kind of give everyone else a bad reputation. And so I don't want to get too critical on bishops. It's more the system. And what I'm going to get into is kind of showing how fraud is kind of prevalent all throughout the history of the church. And I'll get into details, but it's just interesting to try to nitpick I'm going to make up a word here, the little fraudy things that members of the church do. And this is not exclusive to the Mormon church. There's fraud everywhere, but it's just interesting to watch people in the church committing fraud and going, did they learn that from their church leaders? So, I mean, I throw that question out there as a legitimate question. But then again, it's more of a systemic thing, I believe. One of the really interesting cases we worked was one where a man was part owner of a company, and he was kind of offloading, and this is just per reports and different things that we learned as through the course of this investigation. He was offloading a lot of his work to his counterparts or to just different divisions within this organization. He was offloading a lot of work, and the rumor going around the office, and I'm going to acknowledge right now, this is hearsay, but the rumor going around the office was that he was getting called to be a general authority. He was a stake president at the time. So he was basically clearing his plate to be called as a 70. And as a 70 or any general authority, you basically quit your job, your profession, and your new job is to go and work for the church, basically. There's different jobs within the 70. You might preside over an area in the world. So, for example, here in Utah, there is an area 70 that's kind of the person that's in charge of the stake presidents, and who's in charge of the bishops, who's in charge of the ward, the local ward. And so, and they've got other responsibilities, and I actually wouldn't even venture to guess what all responsibilities they have, but they are compensated for their work. And so it is a new career path, basically. And anyway, so this guy was like clearing his plate, if you will, of responsibilities. And yeah, the rumor was he was going to be a general authority, which to me, as an investigator that's uncovered lots of fraud that has his name on it, as well as others within the organization. But I mean, I had strong evidence on this guy, and he a general conference was coming up, and so I was just like kind of excited to see what happened. Now, the general conference is on a weekend. If you're not a Mormon or just don't know, general conference is twice a year. It's on a Saturday, Sunday. I think there's some meetings Friday night, maybe. I don't know. It's been so many years since I've attended. But so general conference is on a weekend, and it's coming up. And the Thursday before the general conference, a search warrant was served on their office by law enforcement as a result of our investigation. And I don't know who. It wasn't me. I will tell you right now, I did not make any phone calls to the church. I wanted to, but I didn't. And so I don't know if he self-reported, if somebody else reported him. But what I do know is that I paid close attention. There's one like speaker slot within the 2 days of scheduled speakers. At one point, and I think it's generally the Saturday afternoon session. I really can't remember, but let's just say I'm right, just for the sake of making me feel really good about myself. And they release a bunch of general authorities, and then they call a bunch of general authorities. And what I know is I counted how many they released and how many they called, and they called one less than they released. So in my mind, the story I told myself in my mind was that last spot was slated for this guy. So again, I don't know if that rumor was true. I do know he was a stake president, and he continued being a stake president for some time until his generally stake president served for 10 years, and he served for about 10 years. So just really interesting. And again, it kind of rubbed me wrong that I'm like, okay, we're talking like really high up positions in the church. You're committing fraud. Like, bro, you have to have a temple recommend at that level, I believe. I mean, you're the one that's interviewing people to see if they're worthy to go into the temple. And again, and I think I covered it in part one, but one of the questions on the temple recommend interview is, are you honest in your dealings with your fellow man? Now, I know again that question, the wording has changed now, because the last time I was interviewed, it wasn't worded that way, but it was the same. There's still a question on there that asks basically the same thing. Are you honest? And this guy was not. Now, maybe he convinced himself that he was, but he was not. And I knew it. And so it was frustrating to see somebody carry on in a position like that within the church, and knowing that I caught him red-handed committing fraud. So it was frustrating. But all right, let's see. The next section I've got here are just different things. So we're gonna start calling out things, packing the shelf. I mentioned some of this here in part one, in case you missed it or don't care to jump back to part one. I'll cover a couple of these just real quick. But there were a couple callings that I know 100% were not from God. And I don't think anyone could convince me otherwise. The first one was the nursery calling, where Kimberly and I were struggling with infertility. And it was a very emotional thing just to be around kids as we were trying to have our own. And then we were called to go and watch after people's kids so that they can attend their church meetings. And then the other one was the Scouts. I couldn't stand Scouts as a kid, because it felt like I was being dragged to a church activity. And I am a very outdoorsy person. I'm very capable outdoors. I know that's not the only thing that Scouts is about, but I didn't care for it. And I didn't care to try to care for it, I guess, for lack of a better term. So, but I was called into there, Bishop's just, after telling them that, Bishop's just like, hey, well, I think you'll do a really good job. And so, like I said last session, I asked to be released. I wasn't doing the job justice. And I thought a lot about those young men and their expectations, but moreover, the expectations of the parents. Because again, in the church, many parents required their young boys to become an Eagle Scout before they could have their driver's license or different things. So anyway, so I wasn't doing a good service for them or their parents, really them. So the couple callings, yeah, I'm absolutely convinced they weren't from God. There was one of the things that didn't necessarily go up on my shelf yet, but I'll just mention it here, is when I was a physical facilities rep and I was in charge of getting people to help clean the church twice every week. It was frustrating, number one, to beg people. Now, there were a lot of people in the ward that would just jump right on it. just really great people. They are, oh yeah, absolutely. I'll help clean the building. It's believed to be Christ's house. And so I guess you could call it an honor to clean his toilets. So others, I had to really beg, and it was just frustrating because I was then, if they didn't show up, then I was there scrubbing the toilets multiple times a month because a family didn't show, and that was frustrating. Now, knowing what I know, and we'll get into it, with how much money the church has been hoarding for so many years, now it's like, wow, you could have been paying a housekeeping service instead of having me beg people to help me clean your toilets. That's frustrating. And I know I'm taking away the whole spirit of service. There's a scripture in the Book of Mormon that says, if you're in the service of your fellow man, you're only in the service of your God. And so service is a really, really big thing in the church. So I guess, when you're cleaning Jesus's toilets, sorry, I don't mean to sound such a jerk. When you're cleaning the toilets in the church, you're looking at it as doing service, and you feel good about it, and you do. Honestly, when we would go as a family to help clean the church, yeah, it felt great. It really did. Knowing that you're doing some good, but now knowing that instead of spending money on housekeeping services, they ask church members to do all that for free. That's where to me, it just kind of rubs me the wrong way. We'll get into all that money stuff here shortly. I don't know if I mentioned this last time. I don't think I did. So tithing. So tithing is, again, you're paying 1/10 of your income to the church. And again, in your mind, you might have an idea of where this money goes. I certainly did, and it felt good to pay tithing. It really did, because I was like, man, I am helping somebody else, and that's really cool. And people build testimonies around tithing. They're like, yeah, I'd stopped paying tithing, and then we started struggling financially, and I started paying tithing, and all of a sudden things worked out really well. And a lot of people will bear their testimony about tithing with some type of miracle story like that. And that's great. I mean, I now kind of think it's more things just kind of happen and you attribute it to something like that and call that it's from God. But whatever makes you feel better, I think that's great. Anything that makes us feel good, that's not hurting somebody else, I'm all for it. So, but so the way we did it though is we have all of our finances, most of our finances are on just kind of like auto transfer. Everything's just kind of in autopilot. If we were to get a raise and therefore our 10% should be increased to a larger number, then we would go in and adjust that, and then we would just leave it on autopilot. And by that I mean every time we would get paid, 10% would shoot over to a savings account. And it wasn't like a high yield savings account or anything like that. And at the end of the year, you have to go in. You don't have to, but you're encouraged to go in and talk to the bishop and do what used to be called tithing settlement. Tithing settlement is what it was called. Now it's tithing declaration. Same thing. You basically go to the bishop and you say, he asks you, are you a full tithe payer? And you say yes, or you say no. And then sometimes you talk a little bit about some of the blessings that maybe you've received that you got from paying your tithing, or it's a private conversation. I'm sure the bishop just talks about whatever he's inspired to talk about with you at that time. But one of the tithing settlement or the tithing declarations that my wife and I went to, and right leading up to this declaration, we would just empty that account. Even like the interest that it made. And again, it wasn't like a ton of interest because it was just a basic savings account, but we just emptied it all the way to zero once a year. and either wrote a check to the church and gave it to them in a tithing envelope, or we got super fancy some years ago, and the church now has the ability to accept it online. So at any rate, we would give the money to the church before our tithing settlement. So we go into this one year, and the bishop goes, "So I see that you're paying your tithing one time a year." Yeah, that's right. And he goes, "Well, with paying tithing, that a lot of blessings can come from paying your tithing, but don't you think that you would rather have blessings each month rather than just once a year?" And I just thought, dude, you're missing the point here. Number one, tithing is between me and God knows that I'm putting this money away and for what purpose I'm putting this money away. And God also knows that I'm going to pay it. He knows everything, right? I mean, that's what we learn. God is what's the omnipotent, I believe, all knowing. I think that's the word. So anyway, it just really rubbed me wrong. So I'm like, bro, like, you don't need my money every month. And maybe I've never been a bishop. Maybe they do. I don't know. But it kind of bothered me. But again, you put that crap on the shelf because that, letting something like that eat away at you, that's not a healthy thing. So then you move on. Okay. Next thing I've got listed here. Oh, I talked about this last time, withholding the sacrament from a sinner. So again, I kind of think about the sacrament as being like a medication for the sick. A lot of people talk about church is like a hospital, and you go there because none of us are perfect and none of us are close enough to being like Jesus. And so that's why we go to church, to get better. We don't go to church because we're good, we're perfect. So I kind of look at it like that. And so if you mess up, if you sin and have to go talk to the bishop, then the bishop, I mean, here's an example. If you masturbated, they've kind of shied away from masturbation being, as serious as they used to. But you go talk to the bishop and say, "Hey, yeah, you know what, bishop, I masturbated," which has been proven to be a completely normal thing, actually. Very normal, healthy thing to do, but not in the church. So you go talk to the bishop and he tells you, "Well, I want you to skip sacrament for 2 weeks." So now you feel like, well, crap, I'm worthless. I screwed up. God's mad at me. Jesus is mad at me. And now I'm sick, right? Like, I need medicine. Well, the sacrament is that medicine. It's a symbolic of Christ's atonement, his body and blood that he gave and shed for us. And so, and we also learn that every time we take the sacrament, we're renewing our covenants that we made at baptism to try really hard to be perfect, or as perfect as we possibly can. And then the next week, you kind of reconcile with yourself and say, "Okay, what can I do better? Where did I fall short this week? What can I do this coming week to be even better?" And that's the beauty of the sacrament. Like, the power of the sacrament is self-reflection, and you're kind of making a new promise with God that you're going to do better. Well, now you're not allowed to take the sacrament. You have to just sit there in shame, and then anybody that watches the fact that you didn't take the sacrament, now all of a sudden they're wondering, why not? Why did he not take the sacrament? So it is a disgraceful practice, and I just can't stand it. All right. So in November 2015, the church came out with a policy. So this is during the time of same-sex marriage being legalized, really all throughout the world. I mean, it wasn't just, every country all at the same time. In fact, a lot of countries still don't allow it, but it was a big movement for same-sex marriages to be legalized, including in the United States. So the church worked so hard to oppose this legislation, to oppose the Supreme Court. They spent so much money to oppose, legalizing this. And in November of 2015, they released a new policy that if you were actively part of the LGBTQ plus community, then you could not participate in any church. I don't know if it's just like ordinances. I think it was ordinances, but like you couldn't even, I don't think you could have even said a prayer in church, in a Sunday school class, or participated in any way. And in fact, those people, when identified, were actually excommunicated from the church, even leading up to that. I mean, it was a big deal. Now, here's the thing. At the time, and I hate that I felt this way, but this is just complete transparency here. This is how I felt at the time. I thought, well, God, he made our bodies the way he made them. And he made us to, one of our purposes is to procreate. And I just feel uncomfortable just like going through this, but I want you to know where I was mentally at the time and why my shelf didn't break. It just cracked. And so I was like, okay, he's made us to procreate. Well, I can't procreate with another man. And two women can't procreate together. So yeah, I can see why God doesn't accept the practice of, gay couples, queer couples. I can see where God is not okay with that. Although I have gay friends and queer friends, like I can still love them, but the truth is hard. And the truth is that maybe God just that's not okay with God. And that's where I was mentally. Again, I hate that, but that's where I was. The part about this policy that got me, though, was it also said, and if you are a child of one of those parents, you also could not be baptized and participate in the church ordinances. And that just rubbed me so wrong, so wrong. Because well, I was serving at the time in the primary, where you have kids that are, how old? The nursery is technically part of the primary, but you're a little bit older than 18 months when you start going. I want to say it's probably around 2 or 3 years old, probably 3, maybe 4. I don't know. I can't remember when primary starts. Anyway, so you're just these little kids all the way up to 12 years old, or 11 years old, technically. At 12, they leave. And so you're teaching these kids, and you're singing all these songs, and technically, in my opinion, you're indoctrinating these kids through fun songs. And I'll get to why. There's a song called Follow the Prophet that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more in depth. And anyway, the song that we were teaching the children at the time was, you teach them the Article of Faith songs. Now, the Articles of Faith are a set of beliefs. So back in the early days of the church, from what I understand, Joseph Smith was asked, what exactly do Mormons believe? And they set out basically 13 different beliefs. And you can Google them, 13 Articles of Faith, Mormon Church, or they're in the scriptures. And when something lands in the scriptures, like it's pretty serious. And so we've got these 13 Articles of Faith. And through time, I'm kind of comparing what the church leadership is doing compared to these Articles of Faith. And I've got 3 different ones that we're going to violate here in this session. So The second article of faith says that we believe that men will be punished for their own sins and not for Adam's transgressions. So what does that mean? That means that Adam and Eve, our parents, I'm going to put that in quotes, our parents, they fell because they ate the fruit. So then they became carnal. They became, what's the word? Mortals. They basically became mortals at that point when they ate the fruit, and that was the original sin. That was the first sin. And so what this article of faith is saying is we will not be judged because of the sins of our parents. We will be judged by our own sins. And so again, I'm accepting homosexuality at this time as a sin. And I'm like, okay, whatever. It sucks. And I hate that because I have people very close to me that were homosexual or are homosexual. And I'm like, man, that's just too bad. But I get it. But their kids, that bothered me. That bothered me like big time. And to me, it directly violates this article of faith. Now, the church had come out and said, no. The reason for this policy change is because we didn't want to tear apart families. So there was an extreme undertone of hate and homophobia, I think, with this policy change. They come out and say, well, we didn't want to tear apart families. Well, and the justification there, and so I'll just explain that just to kind of explain both sides here. The thought was, if I'm like an 8-year-old, 10-year-old young boy, and I want to be baptized, but I've got my dads are gay, even if they're legally married, they're still gay, and that's a sin. Then as I'm going to church, I'm going to start learning about what sinners my parents are, and that's going to drive a wedge between me and my parents. So it's frustrating also because you're taking the agency away from that person that you've prohibited from participating because of the sins of their fathers. So it doesn't add up, and the church spins things in so many different creative ways that and they're pretty good at it. They're really good at it, to the point that a lot of times you're going, oh, okay, yeah, I get that. I'll accept that. One of the other songs, then I mentioned that I would talk about it. We're going to actually talk about it a few times here. Is a song called "Follow the Prophet." This song actually goes through. It goes through. Let me pull it up here, and I'll actually read you the lyrics. But it goes through several verses. In one of the in the end of each chorus, it says, "Follow the prophet, follow the prophet, follow the prophet. Don't go astray. Follow the prophet, follow the prophet, follow the prophet. He knows the way." And when you're singing that song, all of my Mormon, my active Mormon, even former, Mormon friends, that song's gonna get stuck in their head. You're welcome. So you actually say that, follow the prophet. You say that 54 times throughout the course of this song. The last verse, so the song goes through, talks about Noah, a little bit about Noah, then it talks about Abraham, then Moses, then Samuel, then Jonah, then Daniel. And the last verse, I'll just read it. Now we have a world where people are confused. If you don't believe it, go and watch the news. We can get direction all along our way. If we need prophets, follow what they say. Follow the prophet, follow the prophet, follow the prophet. Don't go astray. Follow the prophet, follow the prophet, follow the prophet. He knows the way. So ever since, you're 2, 3, 4 years old, whatever that age is, that magical age that you get to go into the primary. I've got a really close friend that's a primary president right now, and she's going to be really mad at me because I don't know my primary facts. But we're teaching these kids, hey, just follow the prophet. whatever the prophet says, do that thing. And in fact, there's been several times where church talks through the years have been like, if the prophet said it, that's what you do. You don't question the prophet. Dallin H. Oaks, who is now in the first presidency, he's even talked about, this, you don't question authority in the church. You don't question the prophet. When you make covenants in the temple, when you go through a temple session, like you're promising to follow, they call it the Lord's anointed. So the prophets, seers, and revelators, you're promising to follow them. So throughout all of this, you've got this undertone, in my opinion, of hate towards homosexuals, or I shouldn't just put it just at homosexuals, but LGBTQ plus. You've got this undertone of hate for that community. But then you go, well, but the prophet said that its purpose is to not destroy or not separate families, not create animosity inside of a family unit. So, everyone gets to be their own judge there, but I'm just going, yeah, we accept what the prophet says, I think, far too early. At that time, I stopped wearing my garments. So garments are underwear that the church has you wear all the time once you've gone through the temple. I stopped wearing them. I was like, I can't support this. This is just not right. I felt awful. It was a really hard time in my marriage, only because I felt so strongly against this and lost a lot of trust in the prophet. And I didn't want to rock the boat. So I think if I would have talked really openly to my wife, at that time, I think she would have understood. But I didn't want to rock the boat. So I held a lot of that inside. Like, she knew I wasn't wearing garments because she could clearly see the underwear that I was wearing. And I told her, I know I told her some things, but I think a lot of that I kind of bottled up inside. And then I let my temple recommend expire. I wasn't interested in going anymore because it's like, hey, this, I can't get behind this. This policy was later reversed some years later. And at that point, I felt validated. I was like, hey, this is great. They were wrong. It wasn't like, I told you so. I'm right. You're wrong. It was very validating to me that they didn't recognize so much that they were wrong. They switched courses. Really, it was because of so much public pressure. But what's interesting here is both of them, they called revelations from God. They felt impressed or inspired by God to implement the policy and then to reverse the policy. And now I'm like, oh, okay. So these are just old men. Oh, that lighting is harsh. There we go. These are just old men that are trying to run an organization or religion, church, whatever you want to call it, in a complex environment, in a complex world. They don't understand and they don't know what to do. That's how I don't know if gave them grace is the right term, but that's how I got through it and said, okay, I still believe in you being a prophet, but now I'm seeing that you're very fallible, and that you have no clue what you're doing in this space. And not only that, you violated an article of faith, number one, and number two, how many people committed suicide during that time, and even since? How many people have committed suicide because they're queer and they're Mormon and they're being told how wrong they are? Like, there's just no space for that. in our world. I'm sorry, and I know, there's just no space for it. So again, I put it back on my shelf, but at this time my shelf is cracked. I have lost a lot of confidence in the prophet at this point. And so, it's one of those things that you don't repair that super easy. Let's see. During this time, there were also a lot of news coverage of sexual assault allegations being brought forward that were against higher ranking people, either in the church, like bishops, or they were sex abuse situations where the church has intervened to put a lid on it, to protect its name. And there are so many interviews now that I've watched and learned about where the church has paid out money and had the person sign a non-disclosure agreement. And the reason that I'm able to see and that anyone can see these interviews is because, maybe there was another party that was witness to what was going down that wasn't part of the non-disclosure agreement. There's actually one situation where this woman's dad, who was a bishop, was abusing her, and she came forward after he had finally confessed. She was young, and actually, well, she was young, but he did it for years. And when he finally confessed, it was a really big deal. But the church, they just paid her, I think it was a few $100,000, and she wouldn't confirm that because she couldn't, because of the non-disclosure. But there was another party that was present, that was recording. One of the things is she would record the conversations that she was having with church officials, and part of the agreement was that she would destroy those recordings, which she did, allegedly. But this third party that was there was also recording, which is brilliant. But and so you can actually go hear those conversations, and it's just absolutely disgusting that the church worked so hard. And where's this money coming from? It's coming from tithing. That's how they generate money. They've got some organizations, sure, that generate revenue, but it comes from tithing. Like it's all comes from the same coffer, as far as I'm aware. And in fact, during this time too, I think it was in 2020, the church had announced that it's going to separate its sponsorship of the Boy Scouts of America program. And I believe the reason is the Boy Scouts of America had pivoted with social pressure to allow girls to be in the Boy Scouts. So then it was called the Scout. I think, actually, I don't know. I won't even pretend to know. But it was no longer, obviously, Boy Scouts of America. And at this time, the church dissolved its relationship with the scouting program. And at that time, there were also several big stories going around. If you look up Adam Paul Steed, he was a boy he's a man, but he was abused by scout leaders. He also, blew the whistle on Jody Hildebrandt, who is a therapist that was very highly aligned with the church and is now in prison for child abuse. If you look her up, that's a pretty crazy case. But Adam Paul Steed, he blew the whistle on a lot of really bad stuff that was going on in the scouting program. And I know people who have witnessed it as well in the scouting program. And not to say that every scout leader's a predator, but the thing is the church will call somebody to be a member of the scouting organization, like myself, for example. Now, I'm not a predator, but they called me to be in the Scouts. Well, what if I was a predator? I had access to young men um, overnight. We went like backpacking and stuff overnight. I had access to young men, and so had I been a predator, the opportunity's there. And the church doesn't do any background checks on people. I believe the Scouts does a little bit more background checking, but the church certainly doesn't before they set you up to be able to have access to the youth. So yeah, it was interesting to see how that relationship with the scouting program dissolved. And in 2021, the church offered a $250 million settlement to the scouting organization. And one of the settlement was rejected by the courts because the way it was structured is it would make it to where and the scouting organization had to pay out hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know how much money to victims of sexual abuse that have come forward that have been abused through the years. And some of them were very old, like it was a long time ago, but they were abused by a scout leader. And anyway, part of this settlement was that the church would not be held liable for any of the abuse that may have been connected to it otherwise. That goes to the scouting program, and the scouting program then would settle those cases and take full responsibility. So the court said, no, you don't get off that easy. It doesn't work like that. But it's interesting that the church was offering $250 million to do that in 2021. And then there's an organization called the Widow's Mite. If you look that up, they've got a Widow's Mite report that they've been collecting any information on financials from the church for a few years now. And the church doesn't release, the church is very private about its finances, but there's enough public information out there or public statements that the church makes that they're able to kind of piece together how much the church spends in each area. And they're rough estimates, but there's a lot of work that goes into these reports. And so, they are estimates, let's just put it that way. But in 2021, it's estimated that humanitarian aid that the church put out was at I want to say like around $115 or so million. And that same year, they offered $250 million basically to protect themselves and cover up from sexual assault cases that might come back to the church. That to me is a gross misuse of funds, especially funds that people donate, believing that they're donating toward a worthy cause, charity. And again, maybe I've built it up too much in my mind of where tithing goes, but I don't know the Christ that I learned about. I don't know that man would have done that. In fact, I am very confident that man would not have done that. Okay, let's see. All right, now we get into the SEC. The SEC filing. We're at an hour. Oh my gosh. I'm going to stop this. I'm going to stop this and then probably start a new one. But just for the sake of breaking this into little smaller portions, then for that purpose, I'm going to go ahead and stop it, and we'll pick back up at the SEC stuff. This is the stuff that's right up my alley, and it fires me up. So it'll be fun. Promise. Thanks for being here.